Hello, good evening. A very warm welcome to the Goethe Institute and tonight's lecture, panel discussion, coal, nuclear, renewables, a complex energy story. I'm Maren Hoban. I work at the Goethe Institute in London. But this event and the film series it is part of has been organized together with the Goethe Institute in Dublin and the Goethe Institute in Glasgow, together with us here in London. And the series in turn is part of a larger program entitled Green Matters, organized by the Goethe Institute in Glasgow, where, as we all know, COP26 is happening as we speak. The event tonight takes two films as its point of departure: Nuclear Forever and The Red Line, films about nuclear and coal energy respectively. But not to worry, if you haven't seen them, you'll be able to follow this discussion without any problems. And you will also still be able to watch the films until the 13th of November on our streaming platform Goethe On Demand. And I just also want to briefly mention two events we have as part of the series. The next one is on Thursday in connection with the film Ecocide, which deals with global climate justice. And then on Friday, we have a discussion about water accessibility in connection with the film about Above Water. Two kind of technical remarks. We have British Sign Language interpretation tonight, and a big thank you to Sean Johnson and Sarah Meeks for providing it. And so if you're following this, you can pin their picture to your screen to be able to follow them. They'll be alternating in 15-minute intervals. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers for taking the time to join the discussion tonight. And I would like to thank the chair, Alice Bell, for taking on the task of moderating tonight. And before I pass on to her, I would like to introduce her. So Alice Bell is co-director at Possible, which is a UK climate change charity. And there she works on a range of projects, from community tree planting events to campaigns for clean home heating, or research into solar-powered railways. She was also a lecturer in science communication at Imperial College, where she also completed a PhD, launched a college-wide interdisciplinary course on climate change, and worked on the 2010 review of BBC science coverage. She's also worked at Sussex University's Science Policy Research Unit, at City Journalism School, the Science Museum, and as a freelance writer and editor. And she has written the book, Can We Save the Planet? A primer on 21st century environmental problems, and Our Biggest Experiment, A History of the Climate Crisis, which was published by Bloomsbury in July this year. And now I hand over to you, Alice.
Oh, and thank you for that introduction, and thank you for putting together this event, which I hope is going to be really interesting and a really important discussion. You know, we're halfway through the big climate talks. I'm sure a lot of you are seeing lots of discussion about how can we tackle climate change on the news, lots of politicians telling us what they think, lots of activists, lots of business people. And it's all centering around this issue of decarbonisation, of trying to cut carbon emissions. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the COP is we're starting to talk about decreasing methane emissions as well, and how that is influenced by agricultural policy and also our use of fossil fuels too. But it does centre one problem within energy system, and there are many. And some of the people we're going to hear from today are going to help us think about how decarbonisation questions are knotty in themselves, but also sit within so many other knots. And I think, and I hope we'll learn a bit more about how, as we untangle these other knots of other environmental issues, democracy, how energy relates to so many different other parts of society, military, finance, so many different other parts or considerations in the way we run society, how if we unravel some of those knots, maybe we can unravel this seemingly sort of so tightly bound problem of decarbonisation, and that just narrowly looking at carbon is only going to get us so far. So we've got some really interesting speakers. I want to issue a health warning at the beginning of this to say we have ended up with what is sometimes known as a manel, or a panel full of men. I don't actually know what the German word is for manel. I'd be very interested to know. I'm sure it's a special word that maybe gives us some extra insight into this problem. But this is an accident, and it is not an accident due to bad organising at all. It's due mainly to do with people being ill, because it is the autumn and people get ill and the world is opening up. And I'm sure all of us have either been ill in the last month or know several other people who have been too. So I just want to make sure that nobody thinks that the Goethe Institute is so old-fashioned or thoughtless in their organisation to have created Manel. It's entirely accidental. And I hope that you can all cope with the fact that we have to listen to so many men. I can assure you that they are interesting men, so I hope they won't bore us too much. So first, we're going to try and keep this quite conversational, so we don't just have lectures on the internet, and try and have some conversations. I'm going to ask some questions of each of us panelists, and then do ask us questions in the chat as we go, and we'll also have some dedicated time at the end for audience questions. And maybe the panelists will ask each other questions. I'm sure there's things they have to ask of each other. But we're going to start off with Dirk from the Renewable Energy Society Co-op.eu. Dirk van Tisken is co-founder and president of RES Co-op.eu, which is the European Renewable Energy Cooperative Federation. It was founded in 2013, so it must be starting to think about its 10-year anniversary. He's co-founder and board member of the Flemish Federation of Renewable Energy Cooperatives, and the co-founder and vice president of the Belgian one as well. He's co-founded a Federation of Mill Conservation Societies in Flanders, which I'm very interested in. I don't know if we'll get a chance to learn more about that, as well as EcoPower, which is a renewable energy co-op in Flanders. So Dirk, to start off, you are a world expert in this topic, so you're definitely the right person to ask this question. What is cooperative energy?
Well, cooperative energy is the answer of citizens, of people, to a problem. When I look at the members we have, some of our members are more than a century old. They were created when the electrification of Europe started, and they were a reaction to the fact that the private investors were not interested in the rural areas where there were not enough people to connect and to make profit from. So people did it themselves, and certainly the Germans among us, they know that just until the rise of Nazism, there were about 6,000 distribution system operators that were cooperatives in Germany. Of them, about 30 or 40 still survive. But we also find these old ones in the north of Italy, in South Tyrol, some in Spain, and mainly the ones that survived. These old ones are the ones that had a small hydropower station and that have their own production. But then we saw a new wave of energy cooperatives after the first oil crisis in 73 in Denmark mainly, and maybe some in Germany. And then a new wave came after all the nuclear accidents. Harrisburg, my own cooperative was created after Chernobyl. And then also the Fukushima caused a lot of people to take action. So it's a reaction to a problem, and that's always a cooperative, is a reaction to a problem. People take action because their government doesn't, and people stand up and join and do things together.
And is it something that is particularly dominant in some parts of Europe, or do you feel is it throughout the whole of the EU?
Well, in our old website, we allowed initiatives to put themselves on the map, and this gave a good impression. It's more something of Northwestern Europe than Southern Europe, and in the former communist countries, we're actually absent. We have a handful of members now. But we shouldn't forget that it happened all over the world. And so to give you a very strange or very surprising example, in the United States, about 70% of the territory is covered by energy cooperatives. In the rural areas, they were created after the financial crisis in the 1920s. And it was not the Green Deal, with the New Deal, the US government supported farmers to set up cooperatives to electrify the countryside, and they still exist. They're quite conservative. They look with big eyes what we do. We have contacts because we both belong to the International Cooperative Alliance. And so we as a European Federation, we joined Cooperatives Europe, which is the European branch of the ICA, and now we meet them. There are also quite a lot of energy cooperatives in Argentina, in the Philippines. Yeah, so a bit everywhere.
That's fascinating. I guess, I mean, the USA was slow to electrify, particularly in rural areas, wasn't it, compared to Canada at the beginning of the 20th century. So I suppose that same pattern that you first said at the beginning of ones in Europe, saying, right, if you're not going to electrify the countryside, we'll do it for us. I could see that working in a different model in the 1920s. It's interesting what you say about there being a bit conservative in the US compared to some other, or those older ones in the US compared to some of other models. Do you feel that energy cooperatives, and this is sometimes a criticism that's leveled at them, I'd be interested to see what your reaction is to it. Is it all about small scale energy? Is it about doing a small amount of energy in small places and small ways?
Well, most of the members of our federation are indeed small, a few hundred members. They typically start with solar panels on a school, but we see them growing. When I look at my own cooperative, what made the fact now we have 64,000 members, we took the opportunity of the liberalization of the energy market in Europe. We took the opportunity to become a supplier. Well, actually, our members took the opportunity in the General Assembly. They forced the board, I was member of the board, they forced us to apply to become a supplier. And then we grew from, let's say, an average size of a Dutch wind cooperative. We had 3 wind turbines at that time. We grew from 1,200 members to now 64,000. But my cooperative is rather an exception. The big ones are indeed the ones who are producer-supplier, but most of them are suppliers. But we also see them taking up other activities like district heating. We shouldn't forget that, for instance, in Denmark, I think about 70% of the people are connected to district heating, and 90% of district heating is cooperatives. There are more than 300 Danish district heating cooperatives, but they are not organized. They don't have a federation. So there are, it seems, about 700 wind cooperatives, but they are not organized. So we only have 3 members in Denmark. What is also, so district heating is more and more the topic, and also electrical car sharing, for instance. The flexibility, virtual power plants, energy efficiency services, advice to members, citizen-led renovation. So cooperatives help their members renovate their building. Yeah, it's all kinds of activities. Yeah.
That's a really wonderful description. It reminds me so much of some of the interactions I've had with the community energy sector, and how much energy co-ops often see their work. They might start, as you say, with some solar panels in a school, but they understand energy as running and being part of so many other things in their community. So they'll use any profits they have to do energy efficiency work, to look into feasibility of a district heating plan. There was one in London that I was talking to not long ago who said they did a lot of work with youth. the Repower London group, which they're quite interesting. If people who are watching haven't heard of them, I recommend Googling them. Are quite an unusual energy cooperative group. They have solar interns who live on council-owned housing, and they train up teenagers to install the solar. And one of the things that they found was that there'd been a lot of knife crime in one of the areas they worked in, a lot of people dying because of knife crime. And one of their solar interns had died due to this. And one of the things that they found was that their community of solar installers had become a community that helped the local people deal with that grief. And it's not something you think about when you set up an energy community club necessarily, is you're going to help people deal with knife crime. But it's a good example of how community energy can bring so much more to a community. And I wanted to share that story because it's a nice story, but I also to send it back to you, Dirk. Is there anything, you've worked with so many energy cooperatives all over Europe, you must hear stories like this all the time. Is there any sort of examples of an energy co-op where you think, wow, this is how energy should be? What's your favorite, or a particular one you want to show off about? You can show off about one of your own as well. It doesn't have to be somebody else's.
Well, you named one of my favorites. So maybe there's a film made by Patagonia, but it's called We the Power. I think they're also in the film, Agamemnon, Otero. Yeah. So, but another good example is Schönau in Germany. So the energy rebels, actually, they chose me their energy rebel in 2019. So I'm also a Schönau rebel. And they always stand in their pictures like this because they resist. So, this is the story of the village doctor and his wife who after Chernobyl wanted to do something very concrete, and but the electricity company they wouldn't do anything with renewables or energy efficiency, and so they got a crazy idea to take over the grid. And there were 2 referenda in the city. It's a village actually, and they won the referendum. Then they bought the grid. They had to bring all the money together to buy it, and now they're actually sort of how do you say it? Catalyzer in English. You say it's catalyzer of what you could call remunicipalization. But there is a bit misunderstanding about this, because let's say extreme left communist parties, they think it's about setting up public companies again, like Stadtwerken in Germany. But actually, what we do is we favor that it's in hands of citizens. So we actually position ourselves not as a public player, not as a private player, but as a civic player. It's a third player, and actually we believe that our economy in the future should be a cooperative economy and not a communist economy or a capitalist economy. Both of them led us to the problems where we're in now with climate change. And we are looking also a bit at the donut economy theory of Kate Raworth, which seems to fit our ideas. Yeah, but we're just looking into it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, that's definitely, I'd say it's something I've learned from working with energy co-ops, is that it's an invitation to think about the ideology behind energy action in different ways, from just that dichotomy of, oh, it's right or left. There's a lot of different other ways of thinking about it too, as well as both right and left. Actually, I'd say it's ideologically diverse sphere once you start talking to all the different people in it. I'm sure we'll come back to you, Dirk, with other questions later. But I'm going to move on to more to questions of nuclear. We've kind of touched on that a bit, and move over to Andy Sterling, who, so Andy is a former colleague of mine. He's Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, not far from the seaside in the southeast of England. And alongside a lot of initiatives, he co-directs the ESRC STEP Centre, which thinks about development issues, and published widely on issues of democracy, power and uncertainty in science and innovation. Certainly when I was working in science technology policies, if anyone said the word uncertainty, they say you have to talk to Andy. He's served on many advisory bodies. He's definitely a go-to expert for many people, including the European Science Foundation. and the UK government. He's worked on policy committees on toxic substances, GM crops, public engagement, scientific advice, and he's been an advisor for the Royal Society, the Nuffield Council, the UN, Demos, Green Alliance, and a board member of both Greenpeace International and Greenpeace UK. He's an elected fellow of the UK Academy of Social Sciences and a member of many editorial boards and several academic journals. I think sometimes that he doesn't sleep. Anyway, Andy.
Unless somebody gives an introduction that's like that.
Andy, my question to you is, so we're back in the UK, and the UK sometimes seems to me that we're just a bit obsessed with this issue of nuclear. Germany is obsessed maybe in a different way, and there's often things that we're people say to us in the UK, oh well, Germany did that, but we shouldn't do this, and we seem to come back again and again every few years of this next big nuclear project. Why can tell us a bit about why nuclear is the way it is in the UK?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. And I'm so good. Thanks for introducing it so much around democracy. And that was a fascinating discussion we just had with Dirk. And it's going to actually follow on, really, I think, because this theme of democracy is so important on energy, both in the way that we heard from Dirk, and I guess John will talk about it too, about the alternative ways of doing energy are more democratic. But what I wanted to say about nuclear, to answer your question, is that we just forget how important the democratic problems are with the energy system as it is. And I think climate change is also forgetting how important democracy is to achieving anything. We hear banners, do what the science says, and we forget that democracy is the way that anything that progressive, including on the environment, that's ever been achieved, has been achieved through struggle. And it's that really worries me about energy, because in the country like the UK, which you were getting to with your point there, Alice, I'm 60 years old, and I've never seen anything like the debate that we're having in the UK on nuclear at the moment. This isn't a question of being pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear. It's a question of the level of misinformation routinely put out into the public domain, not only by government, but the media itself. And I know that sounds like a colourful thing to say right at the beginning, but it's really shocking how it is obvious in the UK, if you go to defence documents, that there is a massive concern, and it's been one for many years, that if the UK does not keep its nuclear industry, then it will not be a civil nuclear industry. It will not be able to afford the industrial base for the submarines. Building a nuclear propelled submarine is an incredibly difficult thing. And on the defense side, I can go into any detail you like on that, but that's the bottom line. It's funded, that industrial base of special metallurgy, of skills for welding, of industrial supply chains for engineering, design, regulation, training nuclear physicists in universities. This is all funded indirectly through the massive construction now and again of a big nuclear power station. The money then trickles down into that industrial base and then that in turn goes to pay for the infrastructure that needs. And that is also needed by the submarine industry. And if we stop building nuclear power stations, the defense documents are absolutely clear. We will not be able to afford to build submarines. And that is why the British government continues to treat nuclear power as if it's an inevitable thing. It's just take it for granted. The question is how much we have. And the debate is completely warped by issues like firm power, by carbon emissions reduction. These things are distractions on what is the central driver. And what's worrying is not only does the government not acknowledge it, it denies it overtly on the few occasions when questions are asked, and the media itself is really strangely muted on it. It's quite a deep and worrying situation. The UK is deluding itself about why it has this energy policy.
Is that? I mean, that was actually going to be my next question. Is the media? You said, is the media quiet about this? You'd say it is. I mean, certainly you and I know you work with Phil Johnson on this.
Yes.
You managed to get a few stories in the press about this in the last few years. Have you felt there's been a bit of a change at all, or any more appetite to talk about it, or do you have any ideas about why they're so quiet about it?
Well, again, I say this because on this theme of democracy, if that's, I think it is relevant. Yeah, Phil Johnson and I have been plugging away at this since 2016. But we have made over those years now quite a few inroads into BBC, Guardian, Independent. But that's always been, that has never been a specialist energy journalist. It's always been quite random. On occasions, we've been told, for instance, by BBC, when they tried to cover it twice, it just didn't get through, which is quite normal. But then on the third occasion, the journalist concerned, a senior figure, said, we'll try this by without the gatekeepers, and it went out on the website. The other journalists who covered it have all been non-specialist, non-energy journalists. It's never picked up by the energy community, even though it's so openly discussed in the defense documents. And when it does get out into the British press, it's got out into many international press. We have no problem with the international press. It's only in the UK. And when it does get out, the government does explicitly deny what it has actually admitted in defense documents. So it will not speak of this in energy policy, because it knows that what it's doing is basically charging consumers maybe twice as much for energy as they would otherwise pay in order to support the nuclear industry. And it's also slowing down progress for climate change, because nuclear is so much slower, so much more expensive and less effective than alternative options of the kind that co-ops are dealing with.
And is this pattern replicated in any other countries like France or the US?
Yeah. Yep. Yes, it is. So before 2016, there was no document, and I've researched this pretty carefully and also claimed it and never been refuted, in France or the UK or the USA, which actually acknowledged the dynamic I'm talking about now, that you need civil nuclear to fund the submarine base. Since then, we've had huge numbers of reports in the US starting to acknowledge it and actually call for it. They put numbers on it. They say it's 26 billion a year as the effective subsidy from consumers in the US to the nuclear industry, which they justify in these reports. They're calling for it positively, saying we need this. We must not abandon nuclear power, because otherwise our nuclear navy will be unaffordable. In France, there were a series of secret reports that never were reported in the press as existing, but they never came out until December last year, when Macron said, very high profile, without civil nuclear, no military nuclear, without no military nuclear, no civil nuclear. They are absolutely tied together. And if France wants to be at the top of the table of the world's military affairs, we need civil nuclear power to keep our military nuclear power going. So he's been absolutely explicit. So its own, and China and Russia, for what it's worth, are very clear that that's what they're, the companies building the British plants or wanting to fund or build them in the UK from China are the nuclear weapons companies. So they're very clear in those countries. Only in the UK is this A, so silent, and B, when it is raised by others, denied. So that's why I think democracy is so tied to the issues we're talking about.
I mean, could you imagine a movement for nuclear democracy, or do you feel as a technology it just has barriers to the kind of engagement that you see with solar and wind and hydro?
I've known many advocates of nuclear who are deeply committed to democracy, and I think originally the idea of turning the nuclear plowshares, turning nuclear weapons into, there's a lot of idealism, and a lot of, especially older generation of nuclear scientists are very committed on that. And I think there are plenty of people who advocate nuclear are absolutely committed to democracy. So there's nothing intrinsically in tension. It's just that features of brought out in the films, for instance, that you need to assume this industry is going to keep going indefinitely. Otherwise, you don't have people to support waste management. The regulation, the need for security, the highly centralized nature, and the fact that it's unpopular have all meant that it's acquired about itself all kinds of institutions that, depending on the country, are presenting things in a less than honest light. So it's not intrinsically anti-democratic, but certainly the kind of thing I'm talking about in the UK, where it's hidden that this thing has a link to the military, which no one wants to speak about in government, that is deeply anti-democratic.
So interesting. I've just written a book on the history of the climate crisis, and one of the things that really stuck in my head when I was researching it was this story about the origins of the gas industry. Gas was initially made from burning coal, and there was a German who came to the UK. This was appropriate for a Goethe Institute discussion. Yeah. He called him Frederick Windsor, who changed his name to Windsor to be appealed to the Brits in the early 19th century, and managed to sell firstly to the royalty and then to the rest of the country the idea of coal power. And loads of people at the time were very suspicious, because they said this will destroy the British Navy, because the British Navy at the time was so reliant on the training that was done by the whaling industry. So people would be working in the whaling industry, would learn about things to do with ships, basically, and then they could go and work in the British Navy. And the two have been so connected that the idea that we might destroy the whale oil industry with gas they had to actually launch the company and called it the Great Patriotic Gaslight Company, so that they would quell these worries. It feels like a similar movement, although the gas industry managed to turn into its own thing, and managed to avoid that. But so finally, I mean, things have changed over time, I guess, and they are changing. Do you see another, you know, I think that the one thing that has certainly, I think we've seen a difference in the discussion about nuclear in the last few years in the UK is people do accept it's eye-wateringly expensive, and more people are saying, well, I don't know about whether I believe in nuclear for other reasons, I just don't think it works on the economics. Do you see any kind of shift in the discourse about nuclear, either in the UK or other European countries?
In general, I mean, it's undeniable, isn't it, the way the markets are moving? And it's been shocking for me. I mean, I've been an advocate of renewable and energy efficiency strategies all my working life, but to see actually what's happened in the last decade has been shocking. So there's no doubt about that, and everyone's been taken by surprise, including for instance, the fact that in the last energy white paper, which was waited for in the UK, was waited for 10 years, didn't publish any figures on the costs of comparative costs of energy from different sources, which had been published in government documents lower key, acknowledging that renewables, even with the costs of storage and dealing with intermittency, are massively cheaper than nuclear, according to the government's figures. It didn't publish them in the white paper because it's been so taken aback. It's like the cartoon figure run off a cliff and the legs are still running like mad. So I think we're going to see some of that stuff come home to roost. But in the long run, just as your example gave, Alice, this is not a new issue. The military impact on, gas turbines, to pick another link of gas turbines came out of aerospace. It's so often the case that and with 40% of the world's innovation being military, but we don't really talk about that. This is just a special case of, renewables. If somebody developed a wind bomb or a solar bomb, then we might, find a different picture. But we're up against a massive hidden part of the iceberg under the surface here. And that's why I think dealing with it directly, honestly, with initiatives like the ones we're hearing about in this meeting is so important. And why the example of Germany is so important, because I think without the particularities of German history, of realizing what militarism, authoritarianism can do, I don't think a country like Germany, which was so successful on nuclear, would have been able to disembed itself from nuclear in the way it has done, not completely and not perfectly. That would never have happened without that experience. So that's, again, the importance of democracy. To get out of something that deeply entrenched takes a sort of citizens themselves need to know, oh, I'm suspicious when I'm told, just do what you're told, when and see this kind of imprint of these military institutions. Germany is that bit more suspicious. And I think that's a crucial, in world politics, it's a crucial opportunity.
Well, thank you. As ever, Andy, lots of things for us to think about, and I'm sure stuff that we'll come back to later. Another thing that really struck me when I was writing the book about the history of the climate crisis is how much the military and war influenced our understanding of climate change as well. It's a great book on that by a guy called Darwin, not Charles, James Hamlin, about how Cold War influenced climate change science as much as anything else. Anyway, next panelist, we have Timon Wernhat from the Wuppertal Institute, and we're going to move on a little bit more to coal. So Timon has worked in the Berlin office of the Wuppertal Institute since 2011. He's been working as senior researcher and since 2019 in the research unit and innovation at the Department for Future Energy and Industrial Systems. His current work focuses on structural change and regional innovation systems in the context of climate policy transition processes, with the phase out of coal and decarbonisation as a really key part of that. Along other issues, he coordinates the activities at the Institute within the Secretariat of the Coal Regions in Transition, in the European Commission, and prior to that, back in the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, he was a research fellow and project coordinator at the Institute for Future Studies and Technology Assessment. Technology assessment. I do remember studying so much of that when I was younger, working on sustainable energy systems, long-term energy foresight scenarios for the energy sector, potentials for energy technologies, renewable energy technologies, and things in energy research policy. So I'm sure, it's a really fascinating period to be working on that sort of stuff. Timon, you must have had all the experience of doing so many forecasting things and then seeing things sort of change in a completely different way, or beating your forecasts. You're going to talk to us, I think, the first question I wanted to ask you really is about coal. I mean, how much coal is there in Germany?
Yeah, thank you, Alice, for the kind introduction. But I mean, since Andy was talking about nuclear and he hinted to Germany, can I respond to that? Or is that
go start with that, please do.
messing the process up? Because I find it very interesting, Andy, that you make this link between military and nuclear. And it's funny, I mean, Germany has decided to phase out of nuclear by 2023. And we've decided that 2 times, right? Once in 2000, then we said, well, maybe we stay in a little longer. And then Fukushima came and the government decided, okay, this time for real, we're going to do it. And by accident, so to speak, I was listening to a talk that was given 10 years ago when there was, again, a heated debate on nuclear, and the very much pro-nuclear speaker, he was putting up charts of, oh, Germany's so special. We're the only ones in the world who phase out of nuclear with the big share of nuclear we're having. We had 30% of nuclear in our electricity mix. And he was giving all the other countries that had big shares of nuclear. And it's interesting. If you look at globally at the countries, there's 2 set of countries. One is countries that have a significant share of nuclear in their electricity mix. And then there's a set of countries that have just 1 nuclear power plant. And they're often smaller countries. And I feel that those countries, I think they want to be part of the club, right? It's modern, it's cool, it shows that you're capable of running a nuclear power plant. But if you look at the countries that have a reasonable share or a larger share of nuclear in their electricity mix, all of them have nuclear weapons, but Germany, right? Germany is the only country that has had a major share of nuclear and has not had nuclear weapons. Oh, maybe I'm side dodging Belgium. Sorry, I'm side dodging Belgium. Sorry, but I'm on my bias of looking at larger countries and larger industry. Belgium is another case. Dirk, you jump in on that. But it's very little, right? It's if you look at big countries, China, Russia, US, UK, France, it is very obvious that most of the countries, there's a very close link, and then there's very little. I guess it would just be Belgium and Germany that had this history, and Germany is it's I don't know, legacy of our Second World War Nazi trauma, basically, that we said we're not going to have nuclear weapons, at least our own. And so it's been easier for us in a way to phase out nuclear, because the synergies between nuclear and military are not there in Germany.
Well put.
I don't know.
You should bring in Dirk at some point on the Belgian nuclear point. Since I messed this up.
Well, let's maybe circle back to that in a minute, because I am really interested in how it plays out in different countries. I mean, it's very easy to sort of think that we're similar, and we're not. Size being only one, many different differences between these different countries. But I mean, you said it's easier for Germany to phase out nuclear. Would you say it's harder for them to phase out coal? Like, this is a question that a journalist was asking me the other day, because everyone's interested in the UK energy mix just because we're hosting the climate talk. So we're like, oh, is it easier for Britain to phase out coal? And he was trying to argue that we've been able to lead this coal, beating coal alliance and stuff because of Margaret Thatcher, and we should thank Margaret Thatcher. That was his argument. But I mean, is there other reasons why Germany is particularly attached to coal?
Yeah, I mean, if I compare coal in the UK and Germany, it's like we always have been behind, both in when industrialization and using coal, right? In the 19th century, UK has been leading and quicker picking up, building a coal-based industry, and then also in the phase of phasing out coal and closing mines. Also, the UK has been quicker and more radical. If you look at how Margaret Thatcher closed down mines in the 80s with very little support schemes for the local communities. That was a very different process in Germany. If you look at coal, I mean, Germany has been a coal country. We've had more than 50% of our electricity was coal. If you look at the Ruhr area, it's been one of the biggest coal mining areas in Europe. We've had, I've looked up the numbers in 1950-70, that was the peak of coal mining in Germany in terms of jobs. And that was 750,000 people worked in coal mining, just in the mining companies. I mean, not just the miners, also the management of the mining companies, but just mining companies, 750,000 of jobs in coal mining. And if you look at it now, today, or 5 years ago, when we started discussing about a coal phase out, that number from 750,000 was down to 20,000. So not more than 90%, 95% of the way was already gone. But it was a very difficult debate of, do we really want to phase out coal, and when do we want to phase out coal? And it has a lot of factors. And comparing to the UK, I think it's true to say, if you look at our industry base, the German, there is a larger share of energy intensive industry in Germany compared to the UK now, right? And there is, I don't know, if you look at GDP, I don't know, we don't have a financial market as London does, and things like that. You could go through the sectors. So there could be more reason of, hey, we need cheap coal power, which 5-10 years ago was definitely much cheaper than renewables. Now, if you look at new power plants and new renewables, that is not true anymore. And yeah, so it may have been a little bit easier for the UK, but I mean, easier also because of, I don't know, of Thatcherism and a much harder, okay, we just closed the mines in the 80s, where we just went a smoother slope down.
Well, arguably, British political leaders have been moving Britain away from, sorry?
Yeah.
So arguably, British political leaders have been moving Britain away from coal whenever they could to oil, or at least anything other than coal, since Churchill, since before Churchill was Prime Minister, when he was head of the Navy or the Admiralty, just after World War I, or around World War I, moving to oil. Because the coal industry meant that the miners had power, and they didn't want any of that. One of the other things I thought, I mean, one of the things I thought maybe you raised in that was worth touching on is how much it's a regional issue in Germany. Like, you know, you're talking about mining jobs, and therefore that's going to be specific parts of Germany, and it will be less of an issue for other parts. I mean, something I feel in terms of my work with renewables is that there is you really sense the nature of regional differences when it comes to energy. Is that something you feel with coal in Germany? Yeah,
definitely. I think that is the key point. If you look at the total number of jobs, 20,000 jobs, of course, that's not nothing. It's well-paid industry jobs, but it is not that much for a country like Germany to really worry about and to have like we need a national commission for 20,000 jobs. We don't. But those jobs are very much concentrated in certain areas. And some of these areas are actually rural, structurally weak areas. And specifically 2 of them, Lausitz and the area around Leipzig, are in East Germany. And if you look at the economic development after reunification, and for example, if you look at the map of Germany, where you have per capita income, it is striking, because anyone can draw the line between East and West Germany, right? East Germany is still poorer, weaker, more unemployment than West Germany, and therefore, since 2 of the big coal mining regions are in East Germany, it's been like this trauma that we've had 30 years ago of deindustrialization of certain areas in East Germany with the reunification, that came back. And even though basically now the economic challenge would not be that great, and we're not, it's completely not comparable to what we've seen 30 years ago, but it reminds people of this old pain, and this is why they're up in arms basically and protesting. And it is very much a regional issue.
Well, but also how culture and histories, and as you say, pain, forms of embodied pain that lasts and stays with us, get folded onto these other questions. Before we move on to Ireland and then come back to having a larger conversation about nuclear or other things in Belgium, I wanted to just ask you if you had any thoughts about gas, because we talk about one of the things I definitely think is a good thing about the conversations about energy in the last few years is we are talking about gas, and we're not just going, oh, we're getting rid of coal, that'll be okay, or nuclear might save the day, but we're looking at that issue. Do you have anything to say about kicking gas? Can you see us in a few years' time going with the Powering Past Gas coalition or something like that, and countries celebrating that they're leading the way on kicking gas?
I mean, if you look at, I'm very much Germany biased, right, in my views. But if you look at that, I mean, Germany we don't have our own gas anymore. So, right, for us, it would not be the same thing as for coal in terms of jobs and regional economic impact. Well, let's do without gas. Actually, renewables are a good thing for us because there would be the possibility of manufacturing some renewables, of having some of that value creation in the country, right? But if you look at gas from an energy systems point of view, it will be much harder than coal, right? It's because it's I say those 80%, 90% renewables. I mean, that is doable, right? You up to what we've done now. Germany now has 50% renewables, very similar to the UK, and it doesn't, we really haven't changed our electricity system, our energy system that much, right? A little bit of flexibility, starting a little bit storage, but it's not like big time storage. But if we go to 90% renewables, 100% renewables, then we really need to think about storage, about flexibility and so. And then of course the easy way out is, can we keep a little bit of natural gas in that mix, right? And I think there is a large tendency of the energy system, the big utilities, that saying, hey, if that would make our lives so much easier, we could just keep things running as we do, and then eventually we'll substitute gas with green hydrogen, but keeping the system as it is. But if you want to go to 100% renewables without natural gas, then you really have to rethink things, and not only technologically, but also business models and things that Dirk has touched upon and Andy have touched upon, and that kind of is more disruptive to the energy system. So I think there will be a big debate about that, and it's actually starting that big debate. And it's also a question of where will we import from, and will we import from, and what kind of energy sources will we import from in the future, right? Will we import like green synthetic fuels from other countries? I don't know, very sunny, very windy countries shipping synthetic fuels, which they've shipped fossil fuels, but it is open still. It's fascinating. When you said I've been working on scenarios 20 years ago, it's absolutely fascinating developing scenarios for the future, but it is very open to which pathways we'll be taking.
I saw someone walk past a London bus yesterday that someone had paid for to paint neon green, saying, invest in hydrogen, it will be the future if we invest in it. So there's somebody putting a particular version of the future on the side of London bus for us to either believe or not believe as it goes. Right, finally, I wanted to talk to John Prendergast, introduce him. John, actually, on his bio, says that he is chairman of the Renewable Gas Forum of Ireland. So maybe we can pick up some gas questions with him. But he's also here because he's chair of Clare Morris and Western District Energy Co-op. So he's another cooperative energy person and somebody who works in a specific one. He also works in the circular economy sector with the University of Limerick. And he sits on the government RESS Community Steering Board. You have to tell us what RESS stands for. I'm guessing renewable energy systems or something.
Interesting, yeah, on the ball. That's well done. Yeah.
And he's founder of Community Power and Policy, and a policy contributor to the European policy on renewable energy and community power. So tell us about Clare Morris and Western District Energy Co-op, because we've heard about lots of energy, cooperative energy in general. We had this beautiful big picture from Dirk at the beginning. Tell us about your co-op.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. It's interesting to hear the guys speaking, because we're a small energy co-op, I would call it, the west of Ireland. We set up about maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, because a lot of the principles by which we looked at energy, renewable energy, was, that 85% of our coal is imported, 2 million tons a year. We had 10 peat stations for producing electricity. We used peat bogs, which are now closed, ironically. Our government took the initiative that they would all close, and we would also close the harvesting of peat in Ireland here, which ironically now we now import from Poland in the interim. So you'd wonder what the vision was in that one. In our case, we had 7 individuals about 5 or 6 years ago. And what we wanted to do was we looked at some micro-generation between homeowners and probably generate and sell power back onto the national grid. And we had an interest in reduction and, I suppose, addressing climate change. But one of the other things we're really keen on, because we are rural Ireland, was the whole circular economy. How could we look at the just transition, the climate neutrality in Ireland, land use, forestry use? How could we look at citizen engagement? And certain elements of that which were important to us, because even leadership, how could we lead by example to other co-ops in Ireland? And ironically, over the last probably 2 years, carbon pricing, carbon sequestration, how does farmers get involved in communities, etc. So what we did was, and I suppose from our point of view, was we set up, so Kilmorris is the west of Ireland. We're in County Mayo, so it's north of Galway, if anyone's ever been there. And we're kind of lucky because we got a lot of wind coming in from the Atlantic. So, we've got a lot of wind power there, and potentially from renewables, we're in a great position to, I suppose, to lead. We set up with 7 individuals. We looked at public awareness, and we wanted very quickly to see, could we empower the community to buy and sell their own electricity, right? So we said, if we look, what happened in Ireland over the period of time was that the wind generators came in. Communities weren't aware of this wind transformation. So these commercial guys are coming in, they were building wind turbines. Communities were excluded, but yet they were attached to planning permission, and they were, I won't use the word bribed to support them, but certainly there was little pockets of money given to communities there to invest in their entities. And we kind of lost in that. I mean, the community's lost in that. And what we kind of wanted to do was, we knew solar was coming down the road, and we thought, could we empower community to get involved in the solar aspect? And we worked very closely with the Irish government, because between 2017, 2019, in fairness to our own department, they went back to Europe and Brussels and said, look, we would like to give of this renewable electricity support scheme, we'd like to give 1% of this pot to community. Right, and so the communities could find a site, look for a connection to grid, build up to a 5 megawatt site, and then we go into a public auction, and you'd be then allocated your monies. Ironically, of the 7 community projects that won in the first auction, 2 were actually 100% community, and 7 were 49% developer-led projects, which was a big problem, right? Because suddenly, the communities who were the 51% owners came in and said, oh, look, we don't have to do any work here. The community, the commercial guys are coming in here, they'll take on the project, and lo and behold, not only do they take on the project, they build the project, they maintain the project, they sort of manage the project, and the community are left again with very little but the fact that they have a 51% ownership of nothing really at the end of the day. And since then, we've been able to kick those guys out of this pot. So now the 1% pot in Ireland is now going to be 100% community, right? And I was in Dublin last night, and Patagonia's Dirk's video that he mentioned was being shown. And my point was, well, why are we 5 megawatt? Why can't we be 10 megawatt? And for example, in this case, why are we limited to 1% of the pot? Why can't we be 3% of the pot or 5% of the pot? And why can't communities be empowered to do this? So what we did was, we found a site in our hometown, a landfill site, a dump site. And we said, look, wouldn't it be great to turn it around from a brown field to a green field, and that the community itself was part of this? So we put in for a connection to grid. We scraped 25,000 euro together by securing a credit union with personal guarantees, and we got our plan permission, and lo and behold, we won that first auction. So we have our first solar site to be built next year. And we thought, do you know what, we'll do a second one, but this one we'll do ourselves. So we went back in and we got a second plan permission, got a second solar site. So the co-op now has 2 5 megawatt solar sites to be built out next year. And this was the basis to which we started off this co-op. And from our point of view, it was huge, because it now empowered the community. So since then, what we've done is we've, and Dirk mentioned this, we've actually embraced district heating, because look, if we could sell power, can we not sell heat? And can we not do the two together? And if I've got a district heating network here, and I'm looking at my carbon footprint, is it not possible that I can now reduce this carbon footprint by centralizing my heating system, putting a piping system around to the heavy users, and suddenly, educate the community and saying we can change the technology at one point, but at the end of the day, how the heat gets to you is pretty much the same. And this is what's going to do for our town of Claremorris. And so we got involved in district heating. And now we have a proposal going into our council to build a small, not 1 megawatt heating system. But again, the principle of it is community owned. The community will own this heating system 100%. And in doing so, what's happened is that Claremorris has somewhat been elevated up in the fact that they've got 1 or 2 things done. So now, for example, we're now involved in 3 Interreg projects. One is a biowill project. We're looking at willow tree. We believe we shouldn't be burning willow tree because why? There's natural value in that tree, which is like natural aspirin, biodegradable packaging. You use it for growing a mushroom. You then move into an anaerobic digestion plant. Now you produce a biogas, which goes back into the district heating project. Now we've got a digestate, which is now a natural fertilizer. Hell, the peat bogs are closed. Now we can use our own digestate, and use our own fertilizer. And you know what? We're now employing 5 people in town, 5 people, 5 families. Now you're regenerating rural Ireland. So suddenly the co-op is starting to see opportunities, all because we took this one ballsy effort to do it and go for 1 or 2 of these projects. And look, we're involved in GenCom, which is looking at green hydrogen. And we're quite involved in the anaerobic digestion. Selfishly, I've brought us into that because from the circular economy, can we look at the farming community? So Ireland have been slow, and we are slow in the fact that AD hasn't been rolled out here compared to the UK and France and Germany. So we've now been proposing to government that we should roll out AD and have community ownership in AD. So not only do you work with the farmers, you now generate this biogas, which now we can address our transport sector and our heating sector with. So the co-op is probably going to 149 people. But one of the key things we did, which feeds right into Dirk, is we built a company called Community Power. So Community Power, with the likes of Temple Dairy, Aran Islands, we can now buy, we're a utility company, we can now buy and sell our own power. And as part of a member of Rescoop, actually, ironically, what's happening now is that communities are starting to look at it differently. They're starting to see the opportunities. And we've always said for communities, it's empowering them by education. Show me the way, and you'll always find someone within your community who will make it happen. And I think that's what's happening here in Ireland. And a really good example was SAAI, which is our kind of a government body. They went out and started setting up communities, what we call sustainable energy communities. We have 500 sustainable energy communities in Ireland, right? And now they're all starting to knock on the door and say, lads, please tell us how you did this and how you did that, right? So the ironic part is that, and it's really interesting listening to the lads here because, we have no nuclear. They tried that. And the Irish way, it just didn't happen. God knows that there'll be no AD here. There's definitely not going to be any nuclear power plant at this moment in time. But we're lucky because we're in a transition that perhaps we can use this to our benefit to do it right. And if we can do it right as communities and take that lead, then this feeds back into this transition and it leads by example. And I think from our point of view, I'm not driving this anymore. We've got youngsters in our board who is driving this. We've got communities within South of Ireland who are now driving this. And suddenly there's an energy to do something positive for the climate, to look at their carbon footprint, to look at the overall energy transition, but more importantly, to own part of that. And I think that's what makes it more interesting, Alice.
Oh, that's amazing. It's a wonderfully inspiring story. And a real good example of thinking big with community energy. You're talking about also and how policy can help you do that. And certainly working in the UK, we had all sorts of ideas of how we were going to scale up community energy. And then George Osborne basically destroyed the UK solar industry, and it's just pulled it apart. I mean, we're struggling on. We're doing all sorts of exciting things. We've got that repower project I mentioned earlier. My colleague Leo is basically inventing solar powered railways, which will be a technology that we hope to bring to the world and give community energy projects around the world new opportunities. But it's a struggle. Whereas you look at somewhere like that you talked about thinking about, why just stick at a couple of megawatts? I don't know if any of you have seen the offshore wind turbine off the coast of Copenhagen, which is community owned. It's kind of iconic because it's the one, why couldn't community energy think as big as an offshore wind farm? The massive one that has been built not far from where Andy's university is, it's owned by very large companies. But why couldn't we think like that? Well, we can't because we're stuck by the policy. Do you think there's you still mentioned a relatively small number though, 149. What sort of work do you do to kind of try and bring community energy to a larger number of people, to involve the people who aren't going to be full co-op members? They're not going to be the people who are going to devote all of their spare time to it, but the kind of people around you. How do you help kind of spread the word to just general people in the local area?
It was interesting. The story I always tell is when I started doing this first, everyone started looking up to heaven. You know, you go to the community, we're going to do renewable energy. Jesus, what they're doing now. And then suddenly you go to government, you say that we're doing renewable energy, and they look up to heaven and say, what are they doing now? The interesting part was when you did the dynamics of the financials, when you treated it as a business case, the community suddenly started seeing that there was a profit to be made from these projects, which they could then reinvest within their communities. And this has been one of the driving forces in this, because where communities, and particularly in rural Ireland, where they've been probably lacking in funding. So we've an issue here, you know, banks closing down within reason, post offices trying to moving. You know, how do communities get, like the likes of Tesco's are great, but you know, the old days, you had the old shops would give a sponsorship to a football team. Now you've got a situation where you don't have that anymore. So how does a community generate its own pot? So not just the employment, not just their energy in the climate side, but how can they generate a financial gain from this at the same time to reinvest back in the community? And that's the trigger, because now communities say, hell, like you've got the tidy towns on one side, you've got you know, associations on the other side. If you offer them the opportunity and they can see that the opportunity is there for them, you know, they start coming on themselves. I mean, there's last night again in Dublin, there was 15 communities within one area who are now talking about biodiversity and looking at whole renewable energy. And one of the points I made to them last night was, you know what, we're talking about, you know, the comment was, well, we can't put, you know, we don't have the room here for these solar power plants or solar panels. And our point was, well, why don't you work at rural Ireland? We have the plenty of the space. You join with us and do a co-op together, and suddenly now you share that profit between the city and the rural Ireland. And suddenly now you've got a crossover, kind of a cross contamination within reason, we always say, of the two groups working together. Ironically, the slowest part is policy. And I'll give an example. We did with Friends of the Earth, we've worked quite closely with, we did solar school projects where you put solar panels on the roof of schools, right? But for us to do that now, we have to get plan permission, right? So every school, watch this now, this is fun. You get 10,000 euro of a solar plant project, super stuff, well done, clap hands, cutting the tape, right? In comes the planners, in comes the consultant. Well, that's going to be 5,000 denos for the planning application, then we need 2,000 for this. And suddenly what was happening was, we couldn't do the schools, right? So we went back to government, and government have now made on the third time the promise that this would be dealt with next year, next quarter. Now this is the third time they've promised this, but this is what's happening. I mean, this is a panel on a roof for a school. And how are you expecting the bigger groups to come in and take on projects like that unless you challenge them? And unfortunately, you have to deal with this as a commercial project, as a community being commercial, to make this happen and lead by and show by example. And unfortunately, the policy is just that bit behind yet, Alison. That's the issue.
Yeah, I still have nightmares about how we had to close our world leading solar schools campaign that I used to work with colleagues to run in the UK, yep. England and Wales specifically. Anyway, I wanted to bring us back to some general questions that we might all contribute to. But I think first, I mean, Dirk, you did go first and you've heard everybody else talk. There was a specific question about nuclear in Belgium, but there were any things that you wanted to pick up on that other people had said? I just wanted to go back to some of you to be able to respond to each other before we have some central questions. And if anyone listening has got any key questions, do put them in the chat so we can start asking them.
Yep, I say something. Belgium and nuclear. So Belgium also decided to step out of nuclear. And at first sight, there's no link with the military, but actually Belgium was from the very beginning of the nuclear bombs involved with the American program, because it was the Belgian colony that supplied them with the uranium. And so we were already in the 50s, the first nuclear reactors were built in Belgium. So, and unfortunately, we trained the scientists who made the Pakistani atom bomb. That's also a Belgian, how you say it, something we did. So in 2003, we decided to step out of nuclear because the nuclear power plants were too old, except for two. They were a bit prolonged, but now it seems we will stop in 2025. But now the Flemish nationalists, which is the biggest party, two biggest parties in Flanders now, They want new nuclear modular, small modular nuclear power plants. It seems some call them PowerPoint nuclear power plants because they only exist in PowerPoint. So the debate is starting new. And also here at the COP26 in Glasgow, there's a very active group of young scientists, pro-nuclear scientists, running around. And they are well trained, and they check. You can't say a word. They bring their arguments. They approach everyone. So it's not over. It's not over. But for me, it's a choice we make, or we have to make across the world. It's either a centralized vision of society. So why is it popular in France? They have on top they have their president, and it's like a pyramid. So and it works in France. Also an exception is also Finland, which also has a lot of nuclear, but it's a real democracy. I don't know how it works, but yeah, nuclear. I started as an anti-nuclear activist, but at a certain moment I realized that we lost the struggle in Belgium, and that we had to show the people the alternative that works. And that's what we've been trying to do. Is that an answer to your question? Yeah.
You touched on a really important question, which is actually one I was going to throw out to the whole group, so I'm going to do that now, which is whether there is it possible, if we're imagining our great decarbonised future, where energy cooperatives and a decentralised system, a system of decentralised renewables works alongside nuclear, or is that technologically, culturally, socially not really very possible? Because there is, there has been tensions. Some people do like both, some people are separate. And as you said at the beginning, Dirk, there have been one of the waves of community energy came in the 70s from people not just responding to the oil crisis, but responding to the push towards nuclear around that time. So I was just wondering if people in the panel had thoughts about that. Are these two very separate models of thinking about energy that cannot coexist? Andy?
I'm sure colleagues here have got a better view on this than me, but just for what it's worth, my take on this, I just did a paper with some colleagues just last year, looking empirically at what statistically is the association of the uptake of nuclear and the uptake of renewables in countries around the world. There are 30-something countries with nuclear, so you can look at both in those countries. We also looked at carbon emissions abatement as well. And cutting a long story short, we found that you can find a significant association between uptake of renewables and lower carbon emissions, taking account of everything like GDP and other population factors. You cannot find that for nuclear. There is no statistical effect showing lower carbon emissions in countries which have high uptake of nuclear on average. These are not causal, just associations, but what you can show also is that uptake of renewables varies inversely with uptake of nuclear. So on average, with very complex things going on, there is empirically a crowding out effect. So it's not just people theorizing that nuclear and renewables don't fit for various operational reasons to do with the inflexibility of nuclear, the large unit size and so on. They're not a good complement for reasons that have been said, like in the way gas is. There's a possible argument on small modular reactors, which have been mentioned here. By the way, where do they come from? Submarines. They're submarine reactors. It's like going home to mama, when as the whole industry fails, despite the economies of scale in large reactors, we're suddenly getting this really amazing story that somehow we abandon decades of economies of scale and go back to small reactors. And the reason for that is at least the small reactors are the reactors they put in the submarines. So, and those, though, to be fair, are more flexible. So, it's not impossible, I would say, but the cultures of the two are probably much more important than even the technicalities. And I think for that reason, there's a lot of tension. You can have a very diverse system with many different technologies, but without any of them, including nuclear.
Does anybody else want to comment on the idea of any tension between decentralized renewables and nuclear, either in PowerPoint version or otherwise. Timon?
Yeah, maybe I mean, I wouldn't say it's utterly impossible, right, to have a mix of nuclear and renewables, right? And I think there will be some countries that will be trying for that. But in generally, I mean, Andy quickly touched upon that, nuclear is not very flexible. If basically large nuclear, you want to have a straight line of 24 days, 24 hours, 7 days a week, same base load, and in a system with renewables where there's ups and downs, you need a corresponding other energy that are flexible and balances out. And nuclear just cannot do that, or cannot do that very easily. You really have to. It's difficult. So from that, just technically, nuclear and renewables would not be a good match, right? And on the other thing, it's I think that is the question of how much centralized and decentralized power or energy in general we have. And I think in the future we have both, but it's you have to be aware that it's the energy market is not a free market. It's an extremely regulated market. And if you look at the renewables uptake in Germany, it is just by the way our renewables feed-in tariff was designed that in the early phase, it very much favored small installations and basically small investors, right? Anybody could invest. And if you look at, I would have to look it up, but in 2015 or so, I don't know, more than 60–70% of our renewables was owned not by the big, we have 4 big utilities, not by those 4 big utilities, but by anybody else, small utilities like the rebels that were mentioned, by private owners, cooperatives, and so. And now our support scheme has changed and it favors large installation, which is good, as we said, for offshore wind, right? It's hard to run offshore wind. I couldn't afford an offshore wind plan, but I could afford a solar panel on a roof if I had my own house. But you have to be very careful. If you want to keep that decentralized part and the democracy part of it, you have to be very careful of how you design your energy markets. And energy markets are designed by policymakers. They're not free markets. And I think that's just to be very important to keep in the back of your mind.
That's a really good point, and it brings me on to my next question, which, oh, John, did you want to talk about, I was going to bring us into more decentralized renewables, but go on. Yeah.
No, just one interesting point, and I know we speak here about in Ireland, but we've interconnectors. And we've got this argument about, well to wheel on our electric cars, but guess what? Where that power be coming from? So this impacts not just the country, there's offsets that impacts everybody. And we, I don't know if people realize this, but it's not just centralized and UK, Germany, or France, or wherever. We too are part of this. Unfortunately, we just maybe turn a blind eye to it, but we are just as guilty of using that as the ones who generate it. So I think it's just a point to consider as well when looking at your carbon footprint of your electric car or whatever you're going to do. Consider those points.
Yeah, I have a colleague who every now and again tries to dream up some way of doing a public engagement with interconnectors campaign, because it's one of the many parts of our energy infrastructure that is hidden and not discussed, because it's easy to have a conversation, or it's easier to have a conversation about solar power because we can bring a solar panel and put it on a school. It's a bit harder to do it something like interconnectors, but yeah, that's a really good point. I wanted to ask one more question of the panel about energy policy, kind of actually riffing a bit off what Timon was saying about how it's so regulated and it's not a free market that people can do what they want in at all. And then we've got a question about nuclear back from the audience, and I'm hoping we might have a few more questions from the audience that will start to come in. But I wanted to just a particular thing that's sort of come up in the background a bit with some, particularly from John and Dirk, and it's something that I know is very resonant for challenges we have in the UK, and that's the right to supply. So in some countries, you can set up your energy co-op and you can start selling it, your energy that you're generating, to your neighbours. And in some places you can't. And I wondered if you had any sense of how important that right to supply is for mainlining community energy, and whether there are reasons we shouldn't have right to supply. Should we be limiting the number of people who can supply electricity and regulating that, or should it be more open and easy to do?
I recommend that. Do you want to answer, Dirk? Do you want to?
Yeah, I think you have the right to supply as a cooperative in England as well. You just have to have a supply license. So EcoPower just has a supply license like all the others.
But it's harder to do. We don't have the same kind of rights to supply in England. It's to do with the way our grid is structured, partly. But I didn't. Sorry, John. Were you going to say?
Yeah, we're the same as the problem with here is that we, like in community power, obviously we had to apply for license to trade, which is community power. The same thing for gas. We've actually applied for license to trade gas as a community based on the ability to generate, varying elements of methane or e-methane, whichever way we want to go forward. But an interesting part here is there's a big mad rollout of smart meters here over the last while and for the next year or two. And we found out they were installed, nothing was switched on. So now they have to go back and switch on these various dynamic elements that allows them to sell to the grid. And suddenly then they're being told, well, we don't know how much you want to get, 1 cent, 2 cent. And people are getting completely confused because they're immediately transition thinking, I'm just going to offset this against my bill, and suddenly they're not getting the same value at all. So it's not in Ireland here, it's not in place. It certainly hasn't been installed within reason for communities to do that. Virtual grids, we've done that under the virtual power plant scenario. Unless you're on the one field connecting one cable to another building, you may just get away with it, but otherwise you're on the grid and you don't have that flexibility nor freedom to do that.
Well, if I can add, so we now have the revised Renewable Energy Directive in the European Union, at least, not in the UK, unfortunately, which allows energy communities to share the energy they produce among their members. But of course, when the member states do the transposition, they have a lot of margin of interpretation. And when I look at my own country, as a federation, we are looking at the transposition in as many member states as we are able to. But when I look at my own country in Flanders, because it's regionalized, the energy sharing will not be the solution to for instance, the problems we have on an apartment block with a common roof. We will not be able to share the electricity without paying distribution system charges. So something which you can in the UK already. So it all depends on the legislator and the regulator. And in our case in Flanders, the most conservative element is the distribution system operator, which is owned by the municipalities. And for them, it's a way of earning money, and so they don't want to lose money. That's the problem. So that's why they try to stop the energy sharing in energy communities. Yeah.
It sounds like a familiar pattern, and it's a good example, I think, of how there are so many layers to these different policies and regulations, and often put for good reasons, but they're sometimes outdated reasons, and people hold on to them for various other reasons which stop us shifting to a new system. So I've got a question from the audience on nuclear from Pritesh. So we've got a question, so it's kind of a factual question, so it might be that we'd have to ask him to go and Google that one because we're not encyclopedias. But the first one is, do we know the percentage of the world's nuclear waste? How much of that percentage of nuclear waste is stored in permanent storage? I don't know if any of you are fact fans and have that off on your fingertips. Otherwise, maybe that one's, oh, you maybe do. But more to that, the more conceptual question for us to all also think with is, given the climate crisis, how likely are we going to be able to find enough space to deal with current nuclear stations or even any more? Or are there ways in which that waste could be reused? So yeah, does anyone know how much nuclear waste is stored in permanent storage? And in the future, what are we going to do with it?
I can't answer the question with a number because I don't think that question has an answer in a number, because you have to really drill down. Are you talking about volume? Are you talking about activity? Are you talking about mass? It really, sorry not to be kind of picky about it, but it really does depend. And then there is nowhere where if we're talking about high level waste, there's nowhere where anyone has got a final end solution that's actually operating. So you could say 0 for that category of waste, for the high active waste, the one that's most dealt with. There are people who are trying to at the moment, and some facilities beginning to go online, but not in a sense that have been sort of settled as the agreed solution to that stream of waste. So it varies depending on the question. It gets very technical. But on the other point, Alice, well, maybe colleagues want to say something about that.
Well, in Belgium, most people think it's safe under the ground in some clay layers, but actually it's not. They only have plans to do this, and so everything is all the nuclear waste is stored in next to the nuclear power plants, and the roof is can withstand a Cessna falling on it, but not a Boeing. But most Belgians think it's safely under the ground.
I mean, just to add to that, to my knowledge, it's only Finland building a dedicated permanent underground storage facility, and many other countries are planning or searching for one. Germany just abandoned the plan we've had for the last 30 years, and we're now looking for a new site, totally open where to put it. And I mean, I don't want to be too sarcastic, but from a scientific point of view, this is an extremely interesting endeavor, because we're talking about a storage that needs to keep something extremely dangerous safe for the next 10,000 years or so. So if you look back 10,000 years, this is when we had the last ice age. So our surface looked totally different. I mean, you just want to make sure that this storage would keep up to the next ice age. And also interesting is if you want to make a sign right at the door, right? You want to lock the door, but you want to make a sign for our ancestors and saying, don't enter. Which language would you pick that people can read in 10,000 years from now? And these are, I mean, from a scientific point of view, I find this highly fascinating. From a factual point of view, I find this, maybe we should not do it at all, right?
Timon, in the early 80s, there was a interdisciplinary scientific research in the United States about this. And the only thing that survives this long period of time is a taboo. You shouldn't go there because you will get a rash or something. Yeah? So it survives civilizations and languages and so on.
Yeah, that idea of that, what sign would you put, always kind of distracts me when I start thinking about long-term nuclear. I get lost in kind of art, philosophy of art and stuff in it, all of it. It's definitely one, I think, as you suggested, something to really start thinking about. We had one last question from the audience, but I think we will have time for it because we need to sum up. So what I wanted to do as a summing up question, and I'm going to go in reverse order of the people who spoke, so I'm going to start with John, is, and I'm sorry because this is really clunky question, but it's what you're all being asked this week. If you were able to say to the core negotiating team at COP, what are the things that they should be doing? What do you want to see coming out of COP in terms of energy questions? John, what would make you really pleased to see coming out of COP in terms of our new future for energy that we're going to be building in the 2020s?
I would think it's empower communities, involve communities, stop this short-term fixing of problems that arise and look at the long-term goals of where we want to go, and involve community at the early point to do that, because this transition that we're involved in, involving community isn't just the fairest way of doing it, it's going to be the fastest way to do it. So from that point of view, I would say involve communities and let them take ownership and give them that right.
Thank you. Timon?
Actually, as with every COP, I feel it's always not enough, and some COPs are even more not enough, and others are okay, but still not enough. But I think what is good, and I think what of course should be extended, is no new coal, no new money, no funding for coal, and closing down coal. I think that is good. But the other thing is that what I find really remarkable over the last 2 years is that more and more countries have committed to a zero carbon or net zero carbon targets. And even if you could say, hey, it's too long in the future, 2050, 60, 70, that's too far off. But countries like China, like India, like Indonesia, countries which 5 years ago were not saying they're going down the emission route, and they just say stabilize or something. They said, well, eventually we're going to be down at zero. And this makes you think, because even if it's 2070, you said zero, and zero means a total change of the system. And then, of course, we should discuss, hey, can it not be 2070? Could we negotiate a little bit earlier, right? That is still to do.
Yeah, it's a real thing we've seen in recent years. Andy, what's your message?
Yeah, I think Timon and John have given great answers about what COP should be against and what it should be for. But just to back that up, I would say I'm really worried about the whole process of narrowing this down to what we should ask of the COP. I don't know of any environmental issue, and there have been many that amazing progress was made going back over the last half century. None of them were made by petitioning some high policy process, and none of them were made by saying do what the science says. In fact, science was on the wrong side of history in virtually every one of the major environmental issues that have built the environment movement. So I find it very worrying. The environment movement somehow think, how can it look at the lesson of history and think the way you win this issue is by basing things on science and appealing to a high level scientific and political process to get it done. The environmental movement has done it through the things that John and Timon are working on now by actually making these things. I mean, renewable energy itself was a mass movement by society, which was neglected by business and government and academia, and just social movements developed these technologies. Danish wind turbines are the origins of the wind turbines of the world. So I think there's a role for these institutions, but we shouldn't look to them to lead. They are holding us back. They're not actually pushing us forward.
It's always good when someone answers your question by telling you questions are wrong frame.
Sorry,
Dirk,
Alice.
No, I very much approve of it. I've been saying the same to people all week. Dirk, you get the last word. What are you saying to people at COP?
Well, there's a big potential in what we citizens can do ourselves in our local community with our municipality. We've had research done, and by 2050, 50% of the electricity we need then, and everything has to be electrified, can be made by citizens at home or by citizens together in an energy cooperative. And we think that we will build the pressure from bottom up, because the other from top down, I don't really believe it will work. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody. Thank you to everyone who's asked questions, and to the various different Goethe institutes that have put on this. And those films will be available to view until, I think it's the 19th of November, if people haven't watched them yet. So thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thanks to you, Alice. Great job.
Thanks, Alice. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.